Hey guys, it's time for chapter 2, so grab your book, turn to page 8, and follow along. Chapter 2's title, Note of Doom. That doesn't sound good. Dr. Bleakman glared at me. Susan, if you have something to say, I expect you to raise your hand. Well, excuse me, I thought. But there was no sense in making things worse than they already were, so I raised my hand. When Dr. Bleakman pointed at me, I said, as politely as I could, what happened to Miss Schwartz? That is a private matter, replied Dr. Bleakman. What was that supposed to mean? Was she pregnant? Did she have a horrible disease? Did she get fired? And whatever it was, why hadn't she warned us? Why hadn't she said goodbye? Without thinking about what I was doing, I stood up and said, I want to know where she is. Dr. Bleakman looked at me in surprise. His cheeks got redder. Do you know the meaning of the word private, Miss Simmons? He asked. Yes, sir, I said quietly, and I slipped back into my seat. While I sat there fuming, Dr. Bleakman blathered on about how he expected us to behave for our new teacher. Then he turned us over to Mr. Smith and left the room. As I watched him go, I wondered if Dr. Bleakman had secretly fired Miss Schwartz. I had always suspected he didn't like her, mostly because she didn't do things by the book. I had heard them arguing about it once when I came back to school to get some papers I had left behind. Miss Schwartz, I must ask you to show more respect for the curriculum, Dr. Bleakman had been saying when I walked into the room. Boy, did that set Miss Schwartz off. Can't you respect the fact that these kids are learning? She asked, angrily. She grabbed the sides of her head in frustration. Clumps of her frizzy black hair stuck out between her fingers. Listen, Horace, these kids will get more out of 6 weeks of doing a play than 6 months of dittos and workbooks. Suddenly, I wondered if having Mr. Smith meant that we wouldn't be doing our play. I began waving my hand in the air again. Yes, Miss Simmons, asked Mr. Smith. Miss Simmons again? Were we going to have to talk like that for the rest of the year? Are we still going to be doing our play, I asked. Mr. Smith lifted one blonde eyebrow in astonishment. A play? He asked. Of course we're not going to do a play. We're here to work. I sank back in my seat. Sixth grade was going bad faster than a dead fish on a hot day. I could hear the other kids start to murmur their protest. Mr. Smith slapped his ruler against his desk. Dr. Bleakman hired me to straighten this class out. I can see now why what he told me about you was correct. Things have gotten completely out of control in this room. Excuse me. Actually, that was only half true. Our room wasn't out of control. It just wasn't under Dr. Bleakman's thumb. Since most of us had already spent 5 years in rooms where the teachers did things Dr. Bleakman's way, we knew very well what he wanted the room to be like. No question about it, Miss Schwartz's room didn't fit the bill. But as far as we were concerned, things were going just fine. And not just because we were having a good time. We were also learning more than we ever had before. My father claimed we were learning and having a good time for the same reason, for Miss Schwartz knew how to make things interesting. For example, on the first day of school, Miss Schwartz stood in front of the room and held up the 6th grade reading books, Rockets and Flags, popularly known as Rodents and Fleas. This, she said, is not a good book. She held it away with 2 fingers like a soggy tissue and dropped it into the bottom drawer of her desk. I know a better one, she said. In fact, I know hundreds. Then she pulled a huge cardboard box from under her desk and started passing around stacks of paperback novels for us to choose from. We spent the rest of the year reading real books. Sometimes we all read the same one. Sometimes we all read something different. I remember mornings when we spent the entire reading period arguing about what some character should have done. Kids who had never liked reading before were really getting into it. Unfortunately, Mr. Smith didn't believe in that kind of thing. In fact, the first thing he did after taking attendance that morning was pass out copies of Rockets and Flags. Miss Schwartz had always read out loud to us, sometimes twice a day. She read wonderful books like The Hobbit and The Sword and the Stone. When someone asked Mr. Smith if he was going to read out loud, he gave him a funny look and said it was a waste of time. Well, you get the picture. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Smith straightened us all out all right. But you know how boring a straight line is. We had no more surprises. We pretty much had stopped laughing at school. Things were terrible. They weren't terrible, just awfully grim. Even the playground wasn't so much fun as it had been. Oh, Mr. Smith did keep Duncan Dougal from beating kids up. But he almost went nuts the first time he caught one of us playing a radio. Radios and music players were banned from the playground. Mr. Smith didn't just hate rock music, he hated all music. I could see him shiver every time I picked up my piccolo and left the room for music lesson. After the third week of this, I said something about it to my music teacher, Mr. Bam Boom Bamwick. Actually, his first name is Milton, but everyone calls him Bam Boom because of his preference for thundering marches. Mr. Bamwick sighed. Susan, you have to understand that not everyone appreciates the finer things in life, he said. I guess that was as much support as I could expect. You know how teachers stick together. When I got back to the room that day, it was time for our math test. I finished the test early. I was still feeling cranky about Mr. Smith's reaction to my piccolo, so I decided to write a note about it to Stacy. Mr. Smith is a total creepazoid, I wrote. That felt so good I decided to keep going. He has totally ruined this class. Our whole year has gone down the tubes. This man is a total Philistine. Philistine was a word I had just learned from my father. It means someone who has no appreciation for art and beauty. I thought it was a neat word, and I was using it every chance I could get. A few more sentences and I was really wound up. This note was turning into a humdinger. At the bottom, I drew an extra tall, extra skinny Mr. Smith, holding his ears while I played the piccolo. It wasn't a very nice picture, but when I was all done, I felt much better. I slipped the note under my test and waited for a chance to pass it to Stacy. I began thinking how she'd react to my picture. I imagined her laughing so hard she fell off her chair. Unfortunately, while I was daydreaming, Mr. Smith started collecting our papers. By the time I saw him walking up my row, it was too late to move the note. As I watched in horror, he snatched up my test and my note along with it. A wave of terror washed over me. I watched Mr. Smith walk away with my nasty note. I closed my eyes and swallowed. I was doomed.